Hello everyone and welcome to the final First Thursday Club talk of 2023, and we've saved the best till last. I had to say that because I usually can hear me, but it is actually, I think, the most important one. So pay attention everyone. Today we're going to be talking about net zero transition planning, which is an extremely important subject, which I'll touch on in a second, but I will actually go through the normal housekeeping slides first. Ayushi, if you can move on to the next slide, I'll go through the normal housekeeping. So for those of you who haven't dialed into one of these before, your microphones are on mute, so you can scream as loudly as possible at your computer, but we won't hear you. However, your voice will be heard because you can write questions into the question box on the right-hand side of your screen. Ask those throughout the presentation. I will sift through them whilst Ayushi is talking, and then I will pick out the hardest ones for her at the end. And at the very end, actually about an hour after the presentation, you'll get an email with a feedback form, and we'd be very grateful if you could fill that in. So if you can move on to the next slide, I will introduce you. So Ayushi is, there we go, a graduate climate change consultant at the Centre for Centre for Sustainability Excellence. I always get that wrong. In Singapore, so it's 8:30 in the evening for Ayushi. So we're very grateful for the commitment to the cause that you're making, Ayushi, by dialing in today. And Ayushi specialises in net zero transition planning, which is basically something that every single organisation in the world needs to be doing. So this is an important topic to be covering. And I'm very much hoping that once you've attended the talk, you will go back to your organizations and poke them with a stick and make sure that they are doing this, because everyone needs to be doing it. And pass over to Ayushi. If you've turned off your camera already, Ayushi, I shall turn off mine and I'll leave you to it, Ayushi.
Thank you, John. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ayushi. I'm from the Center for Sustainability Excellence in Singapore, and as John has already introduced, I'll be talking about net zero planning and what that means. So without further ado, we're going to be discussing today what net zero transition planning means, how exactly net zero transition planning can help a business, what it entails, considering the steps it might include, the processes, and finally, net zero moving forward. So what does the future of the net zero planning landscape look like? So what is net zero transition planning? Let's begin by looking at a brief history of events that has led to the uptake of net zero that we see today. So it begins in 1992 when the Kyoto Protocol was implemented, this implemented the objective of the UNFCCC to reduce the onset of global warming by committing industrialized nations to reduce greenhouse gas emissions according to agreed individual targets, which are also referred to as common but differentiated responsibilities. In 2013, the IPCC Fifth Assessment Report stated that to stop global warming, anthropogenic emissions, which are also known as human-induced emissions, must reach zero. After this, President of the World Bank at the time, Jim Yong Kim, began the call for action when he announced that a global climate agreement should provide a clear pathway to net zero emissions by the end of the century. In 2018, the IPCC concluded that in order to limit temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius and therefore prevent the worst impacts of climate change, reaching net zero emissions by the mid-century, by 2050, would be pivotal. In 2019, we start noticing that countries are taking up net zero goals, with the UK becoming the first G7 economy to legislate for net zero, and China follows suit soon after in 2020, announcing their goals at the 75th UN General Assembly. And finally, in 2022, we notice wide and vast discussions around pledging around net zero, as 137 countries representing around 91% of the global economy are making commitments around net zero. So they are important and they are being talked about globally, but how is net zero planning defined and why does it matter? So the idea of net zero refers to cutting down greenhouse gas emissions down to the point where any residual emissions are balanced out by offset mechanisms. So for companies, what this means is deeply decarbonizing their operations and their entire value chain. all the way from raw material sourcing down to the end-of-life treatment, also known as waste treatment, and finally offsetting the residual amount. And this matters because the IPCC has outlined net zero by 2050 as the pathway needed to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. Also, it's important to think about the just transition, which accounts for human rights, socioeconomic vulnerabilities, and equitable change, which comes alongside climate change. So planning for net zero helps you think about climate volatility and encourages a holistic thinking around this to consider all stakeholders involved in the transition planning process and ensuring that people are not left behind in the conversation when we are actually trying to move towards a low GHG, a greenhouse gas economy. And importantly, why transition planning matters for business is because it cultivates resilience in social, political, and environmental landscapes that are increasingly affected by climate change. So this allows businesses to create partnerships and capitalize on opportunities that surface in tackling climate change. So how can net zero transition planning, how can it help a business? So although curbing climate change is the pointed focus for transition planning, there are actually various benefits that arise for businesses in the process. So I've touched upon the first one already, where transition planning enables companies to align by decarbonization pathways that limit global temperature rise. Secondly, transition planning is key to managing the transition risks as it helps identify and mitigate risks from market policy and technology shifts in the move towards a carbon neutral economy. Also, by considering these transition risks and avoiding them, businesses can boost their resilience by accounting for stranded assets, changing consumer demands, rising carbon costs, and emerging sustainable solutions as part of the planning process. And thirdly, businesses become more and more climate ready. So they are able to build reputation with consumers and investors and expand on the opportunities that surface due to this as the economy gears towards different operating conditions. And because of this, businesses are more and more able to attract talent and create intangible assets such as innovative capacities in-house to support their transition. And ultimately, if you think about it, companies that are climate ready are those that are most prepared for low carbon markets and thriving in them because they're able to avoid the threats and capitalize on the opportunities involved. So net zero planning can have various benefits. So if a company is considering starting their net zero journey, what would this entail? First and foremost, net zero plans should have the focus and the purpose of transitioning from current high emission business models to sustainable net zero models. And this takes into consideration 3 scopes of emissions for a company. So scope 1 refers to direct emissions, which arise from a company's facilities and vehicles. Scope 2 refers to indirect emissions, and this is also known as purchased energy or electricity. And this might be used for heating or cooling of buildings, for example. And scope 3, which is perhaps the most complicated scope, refers to indirect emissions from upstream and downstream value chains. And this includes anything from purchased goods and services, leased assets, and downstream processing, investments, and waste management. So if you are considering transition planning, what would you really need to know? Firstly, there would be 3 broad principles to follow in the process of creating your transition plan. The first being ambition. So under ambition, a company should think about their strategic ambition around objectives and priorities for transitioning towards low greenhouse gas emissions. Within this, an entity might consider short, medium, and long-term milestones and targets in the context of transition planning. So for example, a 50% reduction in emissions by 2030 is considered a medium-term target. And this needs to include scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions in operations and value chains. And within ambition, a company should also consider how their business model and value chain would be affected. With this ambition in mind, And also, accompanying this would be pivotal to consider what the key assumptions are in deriving that strategic ambition in the first place. So what this means is macroeconomic trends or technological developments or policy developments, for example, that a company might assume might take place in the near term or in the long term that helps them build that strategic ambition to start with. The second principle is action, and this comprises of the implementation and the engagement strategy. So the implementation strategy is where the bulk of the effort sits. So firstly, under business operations, a company must think about the short, medium, and long-term actions it plans to take in terms of its business operations as well as its products and services to achieve that ambition it has set in the first instance. So this might prove more difficult for entities that have high greenhouse gas intensive operations or assets, such as energy intensive companies. And the company should also outline the policies it plans to use as part of its implementation strategy. So this can include energy usage policies, policies on phase out for greenhouse gas intensive assets. And under implementation strategy would also be necessary to detail the financial planning that will be involved over the short, medium, and long terms to basically resource all the actions that are being detailed in your transition plan. When it comes to engagement strategy, companies would be required to consider and disclose how they plan to engage with other companies in the value chain, industry counterparts, or the public sector. So this portion may reference key assumptions from the first pillar around what external factors the company thinks will be most relevant in its planning process. The third pillar is known as accountability, and this focuses on ensuring that progress is actually being made. So metrics and targets focus on monitoring the impacts and progress. This includes governance, financial, and greenhouse gas metrics. And these metrics must convey how they measure and how they support the implementation and engagement strategy. So the company will need to detail how the latest international agreements on climate change or any jurisdictional commitments have informed their targets. But what does a target really look like? So just to give an example, a governance target here can include the proportion of individuals that have remuneration that is linked to their transition plan progress. Another example for greenhouse gas metrics might be defined as a metric ton of carbon dioxide equivalent per unit of output. So for instance, in the oil and gas industry, a common metric that is used is kilograms of carbon dioxide per barrel of oil. So per barrel of oil becomes that common metric that is used across the industry. And what is important about setting common metrics is the ease of comparability within industries to ensure that a common unit and a common base of reference is being used. And this also helps us identify who the leaders are in the industry, who the laggards may be. And importantly, to ensure accountability, a company should also disclose whether their targets and their methodology used to set these targets are actually being approved by a third party or not. And lastly, under governance, the company needs to disclose the role of management, the board, alignment of culture, incentives, and the skills it needs to meet the ambition that it has set. So within governance, it should also be detailed how responsibilities for the transition plan are reflected in terms of reference, mandates, and even role descriptions. And with respect to skills, if you think about your company wanting to grow, wanting to transition plan, you will also need to consider whether it has the appropriate skills, competencies, and knowledge across the organization to effectively deliver and govern that transition plan once it has been published. So there are several challenges that also come with such transformational planning and such large-scale change. And as with many plans, not even transition plans just alone, but with any project, with any plan, data is key to creating a credible product. So for transition planning, some of the necessary data we would require is things like greenhouse gas emissions baselines, across all three scopes, decarbonization targets that have been set by your organization, policies and guidelines around decarbonization for the industry or sector that you operate in, and even your organization's existing decarbonization strategy if you have one. So the problem arises when there is lack of availability of data. As I mentioned just now, there's a list of things that we would need, and there can be significant gaps on greenhouse gas emissions due to the lack of standardized data collection frameworks. And there's also lack of consistent standardized emissions reporting across global operations and value chain partners. Similarly, there can be issues with quality. So uncertainty and variability in emissions factor data sets from different jurisdictions can affect the quality of your carbon data. And there's also underlying assumptions that have to be drawn from emission sources. So in our experience, this has been difficult for our clients, and a way we go about solving this is building a data collection template and walking our clients through this process step by step, and also even providing training on the data collection process to ensure that it is standardized, it is verified, and help companies build this capacity for themselves if in the future they wish to continue collecting this data. A second challenge is governance or organizational capacity. So you would have seen that there's so many steps that go into the process of transition planning. And without that technical capacity in-house, it will be very difficult to support such a rigorous transition. The second point here is to drive cross-functional coordination. And what this really means is breaking down silos between different teams, such that sustainability, strategy, finance, procurement, R&D, and business are all actually collaborating, all working together, all speaking the same language. Because something like transition planning will percolate across all departments and will be relevant to all departments. Likewise, it's also important to embed climate considerations into risk management frameworks, capital allocation processes, and vendor selections, which might not have been previously considered in business as usual operations, to necessarily consider sustainability, to necessarily consider climate-related risks. But that is definitely something that needs to be considered for transition planning. And thirdly, within governance or organizational capacity, it's important to cultivate that leadership and foster top-down signaling from C-suite and board members on the importance of net zero targets, and instituting those incentives and accountability mechanisms across the entire company that help to motivate and bring across that change that we see to follow through on the ambition. And thirdly, stakeholder management is a third challenge that we imagine. So inclusive engagement, for example, is something that needs to be considered very closely with transition planning. And what this means is enabling participation of stakeholders, supply chains, and communities. And this would entail basically co-designing transition plans and addressing concerns around equity, resilience, and economic growth with your stakeholders to ensure that your partners, your stakeholders, and networks are not being left behind when you are transitioning. Not only does this help your supply chains, but also helps your own business resilience to ensure that your supply chain is transitioning with you and is cooperating with you, and you have that backing of your network that you've always had. This prevents the breakage of interdependencies that your business has built. So Aviva here has created a concept of spheres of influence to show that various stakeholders and interdependencies of their business. So I've highlighted just the first three here, with customers and clients at the core, after which there are suppliers and then alliances and industries. So Aviva has detailed in their transition plan how they will manage their risks and collaborate with their identified stakeholders. As you can see, there's all the way up to 10 stakeholders here. And Aviva focuses on how they will collaborate with them to ensure their concerns are being considered through the deliberate shifts that Aviva is making in the process of their transition plan. Secondly, I touched upon this in the beginning, just transitioning is also crucial to stakeholder management. And this means assessing how economic shifts from decarbonization can impact jobs and livelihoods of workers and local communities. So this can be especially important for fossil fuel companies. If you think about coal, it's a very important energy source for developing Asia, and a phase out can affect the livelihoods of the people that rely on it, not just in terms of a form of energy, a form of cheap and reliable energy, but also in terms of the workforce that is deeply rooted to the coal industry. So transitioning out of coal would demand you to think about how those stakeholders might be affected. And the flip side is also relevant with thinking about renewable projects and how a just transition matters there. So although renewable energy projects are ultimately aiming to reduce emissions, which is great, it's also important to ensure that they do not overstep livelihoods in the locations that they're being developed. So oftentimes renewable energy projects may displace people, may destroy land, may affect farmland, may affect livelihood activity. And what just transitioning looks like is partnering with indigenous communities, with local communities, where these projects are being built, where this infrastructure is being built, to ensure that those benefits are being shared, and ensuring that a dialogue is being created on the concerns that locals might have around building those projects in their geographies. And thirdly here, it's important to think about your own organization and your own stakeholders with reference to your employees and how you want to invest in retraining and upskilling programs to help the workforce transition with you so that you have the in-house capacity to support your transition. So what does net zero look like moving forward? We imagine that with net zero becoming more and more relevant, with climate change being extremely multifaceted phenomena that affects businesses, affects social landscapes, we imagine there to be a lot more collaboration across industry value chains to tackle systemic decarbonization challenges. So what this means is sharing of resources, sharing of technology, sharing of frameworks that can be used across geographies and across industries, and also more partnerships between the private sector and policymakers to co-design supporting regulation and market mechanisms around the transition. Secondly, we imagine there to be enhanced transparency, so higher scrutiny from investors, regulators, consumers that require the robust evidence on your net zero delivery. So without that delivery, without that accountability, an ambition is really just that, and it can be easily considered or criticized for being greenwashing. So we imagine that this push from investors, from regulators, and from consumers to drive this need for transparency, and ultimately the enhanced adoption of common metrics, accounting, and verified performance data. Thirdly, we imagine there to be more jurisdictions adopting binding net zero commitments backed by comprehensive transitioning policies and incentives. So some common terms that we might see is net zero by 2050. And although that might not be binding as of now, we might imagine something like that to become binding in the future. And lastly, we might see that sovereign transition planning could take off with nation states planning for net zero as a goal. Some of our research at the Center for Sustainability Excellence has looked at how nations are starting to think about and build frameworks around sovereign transition planning. So with this on the rise, it becomes more and more pertinent for corporate transition planning to be well evolved and to be something that we can become much better at before sovereign transition planning becomes popular. So that brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Great stuff. Thank you very much. Ayushi, do you want to pop your camera back on so we can see the whites of your eyes, as they say? We do have some questions for you. First of all, great talk. Really, really important stuff. I mean, I can't overstate enough how important it is that every organisation does this and does it properly. So let's kick off with what is the difference between a decarbonisation plan and a transition plan?
So a decarbonization plan is actually just focusing on decarbonization levers and metrics. And a transition plan is much more than that. So when I showed you the table of all the different actions that go into transition planning, you can see that transition planning is much more holistic, it's much more rigorous, and there is a certain guideline that is being followed when you create transition plans, whereas decarbonization plans might not have any standard guidance or any standard way of reporting. So I think those will be the main differences between the two.
Okie dokes, thank you. Right, next question. Do you get a sense that this is something that most companies are really looking to do, and indeed that they're looking to do it properly and not just as a tick box exercise? This is the old greenwashing question, isn't it?
I think this is something that companies are looking to do, definitely. Whether or not it's a tick box exercise can be hard to say. But if it is that, if it is just something to abide by mandates and abide by legislation, it might not be the most robust and might not be the most productive for companies, because when it is done sincerely and when it is done with all these difficult questions in mind and the difficult processes in mind, that's when companies are actually able to become more and more climate ready. So if you think about it outside of just a burden of abiding with regulation, you're actually able to capitalize more on the benefits that it might bring for your business. Maybe not in the next 2 years, but maybe in the next 5, 7, 10 years. So it should be seen more as an opportunity for businesses that are forward-looking and understand the climate risks that arise if your business is not oriented towards thinking along those lines of climate change. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the next question is kind of linked to that, actually, which is you talked about common metrics being developed and the transparency of approach, but how easy is it for companies to play the system with the metrics, i.e. inflate the numbers and overstate performance? So this is that big issue of people claiming more than they've actually done.
So that might actually be, that wouldn't be in the favor of companies to do, because as regulation tightens on transition planning and around accountability measures, it is actually much more detrimental to inflate those figures, because you're much more easily caught for greenwashing, which affects your reputation and may incur other sorts of penalties, not just reputational but financial, for example. And another component that the transition planning process does account for is that your accountability process needs to consider or needs to disclose whether your plan is being audited by a third party or not.
Okay.
It needs to disclose whether the plan is being audited by a third party, and that helps you to discern whether the company is actually honest in its reporting and honest in its numbers or not. So yeah.
I mean, it will be the case. I mean, it all depends on regulation, isn't it? With all rules, the enforcement depends on how bothered the regulators are to actually do something about it. One would hope there will be strong regulation on this, and it will probably get stronger and stronger. And as you said, it will be a risk to every organisation to kind of fix the books, so to speak, and and cover things up. I think the bad PR that you'd get from that kind of rather outweighs the benefit of over egging the pudding, as they say.
Yeah, exactly. Yes.
Okay, right, here we are with another one. Is there a common definition of short, medium, and long term, or is this something that the company has to decide for itself?
Companies are welcome to create their own ideas of what they want to define as short, medium, and long term, but a common practice we see in our clientele is short being defined as 2025, medium as 2030, and long term as 2050. But that being said, you can have interim targets that are different. There's also cases where 2040 can be seen as a target, and that really just depends on where you imagine your capacity growing and how fast you think you can reach those targets. So 2050 is the most common long-term target that we see, but anything before that is definitely both ambitious and also possible.
That's yeah. Well, it's good that 2050 is seen as long term, because anything beyond that, it's like we've got to get on with this, haven't we? So you wouldn't want long term to be 2100, if that's how you say it.
Yeah.
Right, now I don't know if you're going to be able to answer this one. So I don't know what you know about donut economics, but is donut economics factored into the decision planning to ensure ecology and economy are engaged to reduce negative impacts on design and planning decisions?
I don't know what donut economics are, but
Okay, well, do you
with
want?
reference to ecology, I can say that some transition plans are more and more in tune to improving their iterations such that biodiversity and nature-based solutions are included in their second or third iterations of their plans. So it might not be the core focus right now, but that is somewhere the optics are being oriented towards in the future. So
Yeah, I mean, there's synergy across biodiversity, climate, economics, and all of it. You can find solutions that, I was going to say tick all the boxes, but I don't like that phrase, that achieve synergies across all of that, so that you can meet all of those objectives if you develop your transition plan properly. Right. So scope 3 emissions are always seen as the difficult part of this. How can you make this element less daunting for companies and avoid having it placed on the too difficult pile?
yes, scope 3 is definitely the most complicated. However, there is a framework that is used to ensure that your data collection is as accurate as it can be. So there's a process that is followed by the GHG protocol that allows you to not exactly make the process easier, but streamline that data collection and the data analysis. But with that being said, I don't have the most expertise on greenhouse gas accounting. So I think that would be best suited for my team to answer.
Fine. I do think I saw a talk about this, about scope 3 recently, and they were saying that you've got to make a stab at it. At least make a stab at it. Do what you can now, and it's going to get easier over time as there is guidance on how to do it. And you were talking about common metrics earlier. It will get easier, I think, for people to know what they've got to record and how to collect that data. And you talked about data availability and data quality in your talk. Rubbish in, rubbish out, as they say. Over time, you can't be expected to do an extremely good review of your scope 3 emissions first time. It'll get better over time. And it's the direction of travel here that's the most important thing, that people are starting to think about all of those kind of wider impacts, climate impacts that a company will have.
Yeah, exactly.
Down the value chain and all that sort of stuff, as you said. Right, only 2 more to go. So where is the main opportunity for net zero transition planning consultancy work? It seems to me that Europe is well served in that market. Many large companies are already transitioning, for example. So I guess the question there is, if a lot of companies are already doing this, is your work kind of redundant? I mean, there must be loads. I was thinking the opposite. I was thinking there must be every company in the world, frankly, needs to do this. And if they haven't started, then you can get stuck into them.
Yeah, well, if it has to do with providing that service as a consultancy, or I'm not sure if that means consultancies transitioning themselves or providing the guidance around the service itself.
I think I guess the question is, if people are already doing this, they've already started going down that route, then they don't really need advice from people like you. But I think that's a very optimistic view. I'm sure most organizations could do with some proper advice on how to do this properly, even if they have started. I would have thought.
Yeah,
Okay.
I think basically there is a increased demand for this in terms of trying to create that ambition. But what we've noticed is that after creating an ambition, the next steps become much more difficult to track. And that's where things start fizzling out, where you have set an ambition and you have a target, but then your implementation is, a bit foggy, engagement is a bit foggy, and accountability needs to be much more robust, which is where services like transition planning guidance becomes relevant to ensure that your ambition is not just that, it's not just stopped there, and you're actually following through the process throughout, and ensuring that you're bringing that tedium, like the tedium of the process is not lost on me. But I think that's where the opportunity actually lies, past creating that ambition and actually driving some organizational change across your industry.
I think, Ayushi, as with anything, it all comes down to the personnel and who's doing it. And you need someone who's really gets this by their teeth and really goes at it and is really keen to do a good job. What I found in environmental work for the last 30 years, that often when you're on a construction site, for example, the environment manager is usually the person who the company couldn't find any other work to do, so they give them the environment work. So it's not someone who's doing it because it's their vocation and what they really want to get stuck into. But with something like this, it needs to be someone who's really passionate about this and wants to make a difference. And if you're working on behalf of your company and doing this transition and thinking about all of this stuff, my goodness, you can make a difference. And so it does come down to who you task with this work in the company. And it needs to be someone really kind of passionate. Right. This is just a comment for someone who's heading off, but thank you for the presentation, Ayushi. So this person thought it was very good. There was a point by Jenny who was asking about being able to get a copy of the slides. Jenny, we do have a YouTube channel in RSK for the First Thursday Club. So if you just Google First Thursday Club RSK Biocensus, you can see all of the talks that we've done over the last couple of years. So you can get the slides and the presentation there. Okay, that is it as far as the questions are concerned. Ayushi, you're off the hook. Thank you so much for the presentation. Absolutely fantastic. Really, really important stuff. Just to remind everyone that the feedback form will be winging its way to you in about an hour. We'd be very grateful if you could fill that in. Give us any ideas on other stuff you'd like us to include in our program going forward. Apologies if my Wi-Fi has been bad. Amy was telling me that I was freezing earlier on. I hope I haven't frozen now. I do have a transition plan in place to get broadband. I thought Ayushi would be impressed with that. Anyway, so it should be better in the future. And finally, this is the last presentation of 2023, but 2024 kicks off on the 1st of February, because we figured everyone would still be hungover on the 2nd of January. And so this one is to be presented by Ben Faulkner from our aquatics team. And the title of the talk is Time and a Place, Fish Rescues, a brief overview of what you might need to consider and when. And I should point out that place is written P-L-A-I-C-E, obviously. Anyway, thank you so much, everyone, for attending. Thank you, Ayushi, for staying up and working late to get this important message across to people. And I hope everyone has a good Christmas and a good New Year. All right, cheerio, everyone.
Thank you, bye-bye.